Hello everyone, Jeff Warshaw here again. I promised you that I would wait for a few months to do my quote-unquote in-depth review of Michael Moorcock's latest Elric book, The Citadel of Forgotten Myths. It has been a few months now, and I appreciate that some of you may have gotten it for Christmas. So if you hadn't read it yet, this is not going to be a spoiler-free review, so you should stop now. I'm not going to go into terrible depth. I'm not going to give away the baby with the bathwater. It's not going to be a long review, but I wanted to delve more into some of the overall themes and the tone and the style of the story, which is why I enjoyed it so much. I have reread it now. This is my third reading. As you may have noticed, the copy that I have is what's called an ARC or ARE Advanced Reader's Edition. I do not have another copy, though I did check with the public library to make sure that I'm not misquoting anything. This book is divided into three chapters, three books, actually, two of which, as I've stated, were based on previous novellas. Red Pearls, published in 2010, and Black Petals, published in 2008. The third section, in which our heroes discover a forgotten past, is completely new, and I think is fantastic. I've read a lot of things online about people saying it's boring or it's too long. I completely, totally disagree, and now I'm going to tell you why. But first, let's go briefly into the first two chapters. I'll read you the introduction because that explains something that I had wondered, which is why haven't we heard these tales before? So, Book 1, How Elric Pursued His Weird into the Far World. Just to let you know, the term weird in this context is meant as fate or destiny, not something unusual. It's an old, archaic style of the word. Elric was to say little of his quest in the short time before the events leading to the war between law and chaos. But there were many quests, many travels between the great plains of the multiverse before he discovered the truth of his origins. Meanwhile, his new betrothed, Zarazinia, had demanded that he settle his questions once and for all. With this in mind, he sent a message to Moonglum to meet him at a certain place and time. From there, they set off to see what answers they might find in unknown lands. And then there's a poem. They follow the tale of Adric Heed, pirate venturer once was he, forsaking his sister and his fatherland, for air to sail between horizon and the strand. The snow-white glaive, St. Mary Brookgate's copy, circa 900 AD, Aelfred's traditional. That's the beginning. And I want to read the first sentence because I think it's almost as brilliant as the first one in Elric of Melniboné. The sun, rimmed in copper now and bloated as if with blood, settled upon the horizon. Isn't that wonderful? The framing story is, as I said, Zarazinia gives Elric permission to go with Moonglum to explore the mysteries of the origins of the Melnibonéan race, and he's particularly interested in their connection with the dragon-like shapeshifters known as the Forn. What happened? How did they come together? What are their common origins, if in fact there are any? So he and Moonglove, along with a princess called Nauhajiwar, who goes by Princess Nauha of Oit, which I think is somewhere in the unmapped east, and the priestesses Andra and Indra of Ko, who are priestesses of Queen Siombarg, the Queen of the Swords, who's Ariak's rival in Chaos, and a tavern girl who Moonglum picked up called Sita Teen, all venture over the quote-unquote edge of the world. They view their world as egg-shaped, and they're going from this section on top to the section they call the world below, over the edge. And of course, it being egg-shaped, there really is no edge. But they sail over it and to this, kind of like somebody going from Britain to Australia and thinking that Australia is on the other part of the world, which it is, but it's really, just in the southern horizon. Along the way, they meet this guy, Adric Heed, who is a pirate and a slaver, and he rides this very strange ship, which seems to be partly alive. He threatens them at first, and then he says they ask him where are you going. They tell him they're going only as far as a certain city called His, and he says, okay, go ahead. Lets them go. So they go to the city of His, and there they meet Lady Forentalk, who it turns out is Elric's aunt. And she seems a little naive. She doesn't know what's happened to Elric, doesn't know that Sadric's not still the emperor, that he died, or that he left Elric, not Irkun, as his heir, or that Elric has slain Irkun or Simoril. He tells her, he says something a little odd, but this says something about Elric's character and reminded me of the fact that Elric is not human. She says, "Did you love her?" And he says, quote unquote, "after a fashion." Well, obviously, he regrets her loss. He misses her, as is particularly in the third section. He kind of goes on about how he thought she was his perfect mate, but he doesn't mourn her in the way a human does because he's not human. So he says, after a fashion. Lady Forentalk tells him that she has the white sword Divergent in her possession, which Elric wants, and if he will go retrieve these two gigantic red pearls known as the Eyes of the Scaradine for her, which is held by Adric Heed in his White Fortress, she'll give him this sword, which he wants. So he and Moonglum agree. They go to this fortress of Adric Heed's. Elric is attacked by a demon called an Asquanax, which tries to kill him. And, he tries to, he kills it with Stormbringer because even this demon can't resist Stormbringer's power. And even though its horrible energy pours into him and he hates it, he destroys him, and then he destroys the rest of the slavers. Adric Heed, in fact, is rather grotesquely eaten, literally, by Queen Siombarg, who has a taste for flesh, and along with several of his closest followers. Elric releases all these slaves, which includes Citadel's husband, and she then leaves Moonglum, who is rather distraught. They retrieve the eyes, which are the pearls, which are actually the eyes of an ancient white Forn dragon, who it turns out is Adric Heed's father and Lady Forentalk's father, who Heed had betrayed. So he kind of gets his just desserts. The dragon comes back to life and he flies off, and Elric then discovers that the priestesses Indra and Andra have stolen the white sword Diversion and given it to Siombarg, who demanded it. They had very little time to respond. She was threatening them, and so they gave it to her. So his quest is basically in vain. The second section, based on the story Black Petals, is called In Which Elric Discovers an Unpleasant Kinship. And what that means is not what I first thought it was. And I'll explain that shortly. Elric and Moonglum are now in the city of Nasia Tiki. Elric is growing weak because he doesn't have many of the drugs that he needs to keep himself awake any longer. And Stormbringer doesn't seem to be providing him with the energy that it usually feeds him when he steals people's souls with it. Ariok seems to be absent, isn't answering his call. Moonglum speculates that there's something about a quote-unquote war amongst the angels. That's a reference to the second Ether novels, which you should read if you haven't, but I'm not going to go into that. Elric consults with an apothecary who sends him to the High Council, where he meets with two beautiful princesses, and Princess Semele and Princess Viricius, and they're the daughters of Tylus Creek of the Das, and he has vanished on a mission upriver to an old city called Sum. He also meets, rather to his shock, another Melnibonean from his city, from Imrir, a cousin of his, Divim Marluk, a dragon master who is now without dragons because, of course, the dragons were spent, pursuing the Reaver fleet that Elric himself led in to destroy Imrir in his quest for vengeance on Irkun. He's angry. He's obviously doesn't like meeting with Elric, but he's still respectful of the fact that he's his emperor. And he said he led a previous mission, and it was attacked by these strange cannibals, and they didn't get very far upriver towards Sum. And they think maybe a smaller party of just, 5 or 6 people might succeed where the larger party didn't. So reluctantly, they agree to go with him. He's seeking this flower called the Black Anemone, or the Mauvaluscus, which he believes can free him from his dependence on the drugs he needs to keep himself awake, and also on reliance on Stormbringer to feed him energy of the stolen souls. So they go to Soom. There's a nice phrase that I liked on page 117 in which he refers to Cymoral as, quote-unquote, the dark jewel of Melniboné. I like that. There's a kind of a reference on page 119 to a flying cat, which I thought might have been a reference to Whiskers, the familiar of Jarek Carnelian, who's a companion of Champions in the Corum series. There's also a reference on 123 to the Horn of Fate, which we find out about later in Stormbringer, and I won't spoil that for anybody. That's really all I have to say about the first two chapters. They find this plant, and it's horrible. It's a blood-sucking, terrible, monstrous thing that kills everybody, basically, to drink their blood. That's what the unpleasant kinship is. It's not his relationship to Divim Marluk. It's with this blood-sucking, destructive plant that he is forced to destroy. He's so disgusted by it that he can't think of using the seeds or the petals to cure himself of his reliance on the drugs that he needs. He just throws them away. And in the final kind of jest and mean-spirited slant, Divim Marluk says he has a map to take them back to the edge of the world, and then he tears it up and throws it in the river and says, "You'll never have it." Moonglum somehow rescues a small scrap of that map, and that leads us basically into the third section, in which our heroes discover a forgotten past. In this section, Elric is becoming weak again. Moonglum's having trouble synthesizing the drugs he needs to keep him awake. Stormbringer isn't feeding him the usual energy. They've been selling themselves as mercenaries to make a living, and they start hearing rumors about a quote-unquote golden warlord who seems to be uniting these quote-unquote Amachian knights behind him for some quest that's sort of unspecified. Along this journey, they meet an outlandish character named Orlando Funk, who just literally sort of appears from nowhere on this outrageously tall mule, and he's this lanky Scotsman with brilliant red hair, and he refers to Elric as, Elric the White, and Moonglum as Morningglass the Red, which makes Moonglum upset because that's not his name. And then, he gives them a sip of what's called blue brandy, and this seems to revitalize Elric and Moonglum somewhat. And he tells them that, there are dangers ahead, but he's going the other way, and they should go, meet these dangers. And then, he sends them on their way. They go off and they meet this Empress Milare, who is imprisoned by some of these Amachian knights. She's been tied up, and they free her, and she doesn't seem particularly grateful. In fact, she's rather arrogant and tells them, "I'm your empress. Don't you know who I am? And you seem rather male to me." She doesn't like men, apparently, which turns out not to be true. But she expects them all to be her servants. They're going to take her, she says she was traveling to a city called Kirin Moir, which she refers to as the second Tanalorn. And then she says that they have a copy of this map to the edge of the world, which will take Elric and Moonglum back to the Weeping Waste. And if they'll help her against this golden warlord, Ramada Sabaru, that she'll let them look at it. And they go down the blue road, quote unquote, to Kirin Moir, and they knew that Elric is curious because she's obviously also a Melnibonéan, as was Adric Heed, but she seems somewhat different. She's like a Silverskin like him. She's an albino. She has red eyes, or they're brown actually with red rims, and seems a lot more like Cymoral in some ways than the other semi-Melnibonéans that he's met. So he's somewhat entranced with her. She's also rather beautiful, as is the captain of her guard, who Moonglum falls in love with, Captain Shariza. He tells her basically who he is. He says, tellingly, "I cannot live without death." He tells her that his sword steals people's souls. She said, "Well, we all do that," which is, I think, one of the overarching messages of the book. Elric's not the only one who steals souls. Everybody sort of does it in a way. He's just more, open about it. On page 167, she tells him, quote unquote, forget your supposed destiny. I find that interesting because, of course, Elric can't avoid his destiny. One of the things she tells him, this is interesting, is that the Forn and the Melnovenaeans fled from either another dimension or another planet from the quote-unquote Foy Moor, who obviously the Foy Muir that we met in the Corum series, the frost giants. And they drove them into the next dimension, into Kirin Mor. There's also mention of the Eldrin, who are from the Eternal Champion. It says they called upon the justice of the rune staff. There is none fairer. That's mention of the rune staff. There's an interesting phrase in here which explains why Moonglum is always kind of tagging after Elric when obviously all these missions are very dangerous to him personally. It says on page 181, Moonglum hardly cared. He lived for action and exploration, and Elric was in so many ways his perfect companion. Besides, he admitted, he was almost as addicted to following the albino as Elric was symbiotically addicted to his sword. That's a great phrase. I really love the way Moorcock phrased that. I'm going to skip that. There's mention of the Whispering Swarm in 185, which is kind of a reference to that book, The Whispering Swarm. But this is literal because they're going to a city of Kirin Mor whose treasure is blue honey. And obviously there are quite a large number, thousands and millions of bees in the city. So there's a humming noise that they hear constantly, which is those bees. Elric says something here, which I think is one of the things that makes him an anti-hero rather than a hero. And I'll explain why in a moment. I'm going to read this directly, page 201. Somewhat cynically, he reasoned that most cultures had a returning hero in their legends. He had been seen as such more than once. Now they needed a legendary hero. Elric had heard of heroes with fate-driven destinies, chiefly in his people's epic romances. He had no difficulty ignoring the fact that he was not heroic, nor destined to save this valley. However, in reality, he reflected that by doing so, he and his friend got what they desired, then he might as well let them believe what they liked. What that's saying is that Elric doesn't care that he's not a hero. If they believe he's a hero, he's going to let them, because then they'll show him the map to the edge of the world. What makes that an anti-heroic statement is that he is interested in saving them for his own self-interest, not because it's the right thing to do or because he's a good guy. I like that. He's being honest. He knows who he is. He has his self-interest in mind. I noticed something funny, and this is just a little bit. On page 206, Moorcock mentions a character called Ganilwab Sirab, which spelled backwards as bawling, bawling as in crying. Now, I don't know what that's in reference to. He also mentions the Jade Man's eyes in that same paragraph. In 213, he says that Melare, the Empress, quote unquote, she reminded him too much of Cymoril. That's kind of something that is played up throughout the rest of the section, that he starts falling for her because she looks like Cymoril. Not that she has any of Cymoril's qualities necessarily. There's a section that I'm going to read here because I think this is really brilliant. This is terrific writing, and I just want to read it. It's so good that the description of Queen Siombarg is just incredible. And he says, let's see, he's talking about Ramana Sabru. Oh, 227. I wrote down the wrong page number. Okay, here we go. And then here she came, not simply a golden radius, not merely a glaring force with all the power of the sun. Here was a goddess, a supernatural presence which forced men to bow their heads as she advanced. A pulsing, blazing, fearsome, shrieking, furious giantess with 1,000 shimmering ivory arms. No, 4 mighty arms, which bore one ivory sword, a long, vibrating, curving sword cut from a single huge mammoth tusk, chased with red gold, platinum, and copper, sending streams of light into the darkening noonday, a sword named Divergent. Siombarg, Queen of the Swords, princess of blades and bloodshed, lady of locusts and lavender, of grain and gold and ungorged greed, giggling at him in mockery from a dozen leagues distant. Even Elric found himself instinctively raising his shield against the glaring eyes of a goddess. Siombarg, who now bore the ivory blade divergent, which was 4 blades united or 1 blade divided depending on the entity carrying her, the divider and the uniter. Under her, people fought against people until they were too exhausted to fight further, at which moment they willingly gave herself up to her rule. Divergent did not serve chaos or law, but her own interest. She diverted and divided to rule. She came together to punish and tyrannize. She was the enemy of the great balance, for the balance maintained the equilibrium of reality. The ivory sword, Orlando Funk said, in serving herself alone, seeks to destroy reality altogether, to return the multiverse to her natural state as they see it, before matter was born and mind alone existed in a solitary state. The white sword, symbol of mind alone, of a static reality without time, matter, or any kind of movement, metaphysical or physical. And now a population which fears too much to resist the very threat of Divergent, that it might abolish time and space forever, to occupy the same unchanging moment forever. But why? Because they are mad, Funk said seriously, and he shrugged. Why do women murder their beloved children or sons kill their loving parents? So I'm not going to go on, but that's a good passage. I thought some very great descriptive language. 228, again, Munglum references There's a War Amongst the Angels, which is a reference to the second Ether novels. Can make briefly. 238 mentions the ending of the Great War of the Moonbeam Roads, and that's elaborated upon further later on. A phrase here that I actually had to look up, and I thank Moorcock for making me look this up, but Orlando Funk refers to, as they're being lowered into the temple well of Ciaran Mor, that it's quote-unquote Mad John Martin's vision of hell. John Martin was an English romantic painter from 1879 to 1854 who engraved scenes from John Milton's Paradise Lost, including some pictures of hell and Satan. Next significant section, page 246, mentions the queens of the hive, which they discover this enormous hive, and there are these great enormous queens who are basically just heads and abdomens and beautiful heads. For those bodies had once seemed human, and the beautiful pale faces with staring eyes were twin to that of the human he had agreed to fertilize, the Empress Milari of Ciaran Mor. And he says further, who knew what a mortal like Milari suffered before and after she became a breeding queen, a secret judged by their ancestors too terrible for anyone to keep. So that's the secret of the hive. The secret of Ciaran Mor, the secret that he's been seeking, is that these women turn into these horrible queens whose only purpose is to produce more bees, basically to produce the blue honey for economic gain. And then he's told by Orlando Funk, we developed this colony, we meaning the Nirain, who are the servants of the cosmic balance. Elric wants to know why, and he doesn't really give him a concrete answer. They meet a last living ancient emerald fawn called Lady Greatwing, or Fimorinat Key, or Lady Fear, as she calls herself. And she tells them that, they enslaved her, they kept her asleep against her will so that she could use her venom to help produce this blue mead, and now she's dying. Her body is being crystallized slowly. Her wife, Lady Goldwing, has almost certainly died, and she's the last. She tells Elric, I'm your ancestor. A few little Easter eggs on page 264. Orlando Funk mentions being a friend of Count Brass, which is from the Hookmoon Chronicles. 267, there's a phrase that I liked, the Red Queen of Chaos herself, in the form of a black, blazing Ariok writhing in a cage of impenetrable roses and borne in triumph on a sturdy gallows carried between two elephants, whom Divergent and her inspired treachery had allowed her to capture. So that's why Sionborg wanted Divergent to capture her rival Ariok. And she does so, at least temporarily. There's a whole section, 271, I'm not going to read it for you because it's kind of mad, but of Divim Marduk has these delusions of grandeur. He's going to create a second Melniboné, both in Ciaran Mor and the other part of the world, and he's going to rule it, and his line is going to replace the line of Sadric, and he's going to be the greatest emperor. And we know this is all nonsense because, of course, Sionborg is going to kill him the minute he stops serving her function. The minute he gets her Ciaran Mor with his great army, he's done for. She says, I shall in effect become the cosmic balance. That's what she wants. She wants to become the sole ruler of the entire multiverse, wipe out any resistance, typical megalomaniac nonsense. So we have that as her reasoning. Okay, I'm going to go through. I'm not going to go through that. On 289, she refers to herself as Gloriana, which, of course, is a reference to that novel, which you should read. She also says something interesting. Chaos had gone mad in that quest for solace. Law had gone mad by refusing to accept solace, and solace is from death. So that's kind of an interesting statement there. She refers to the Spammer Gain on page 290. She refers to Germaise the Crooked, another companion of champions, on 291. Refers to Karth, Dundang, Carol von Beck, John Dacre, who's the Eternal Champion, and Erlich Scarsald of the Southern Ice, who is also the Eternal Champion. Says on page 292, no, this was the great white wolf, Elric, sent to thwart chaos in coming times. And indeed, he does thwart chaos, but he thwarts law, too. So that's kind of an odd statement. Speaking of Divim Marduk and Sionborg, he says they were destroyed quite literally by their own ambitions. Divim Marduk wants to be, quote-unquote, the man he was before the fall of the Dreaming City, uncertain, not unwilling to act. He doesn't know what to do in the face of the fact that they've been now attacked by this dragon who just came out of nowhere and has devastated his army. They thought all the dragons were dead. They were certain, and Sionborg thought Elric was dead, and was certain of that. Well, it turns out that the dragon is actually made of bees who took over the body of Lady Fear's dead wife, Lady Goldwing, and attacked them, revitalized her somehow, and attacked them. And then they burst into this giant column of bees, and they start stinging everybody to death. And suddenly, Divim Marduk's forces are on the run, and he's in the losing side. About that, here's a great phrase that I liked. Page 301. So astonished were Sionborg and Divim Marduk that they barely knew to whom they should respond first. Their unthinking and incautious confidence in their plan of attack meant they had made no provision for change or failure. So basically, because they were so rigid in their idea they were going to win, they couldn't imagine that they weren't going to win, and they don't know what to do now. Elric is coming after Sionborg, and she's actually, I think, scared a bit. Indra and Andra have smuggled Ariok Stormbringer, which allows him to escape his prison. He throws the blade back to Elric, who is now, has the weapon that he needs to defeat this army. He goes, and first he's going to, destroy Sionborg, and then he realizes that he can't. He's got to destroy Divim Marduk first, because he's not ready to, kill a god. Phrase about Sionborg that I like. Then she had adopted her favorite disguise, a green-skinned woman with a mass of auburn hair, carrying a double-edged bronze battle axe, and riding on something that was a cross between a goat, a lion, a wolf, and an eagle, with enormous razor talons. That's kind of a scary image, isn't it? Then they've said at the beginning that the city of Ciaran Mor was protected by what looked like a giant stone hand with a fist that had like 6 fingers and that had encompassed the city. This turns out to be Mron, a elemental who is similar and maybe the brother of King Grom, who we met in Elric of Melniboné. He was promised that if he did something, he would be allowed to protect this city. Elric says on 310, he knew that he and the blade were in complete symbiosis. Elric knew by what terrible bargain with evil he lived. That's a great phrase. I just love that. Kind of an encapsulation of who Elric is. There's a phrase, another thing I'm going to read completely because I like it, and again, I think it's really brilliantly written, where Elric is asking Queen Sionborg about these legends of the origins of his people. She says, legends. Sionborg rested carefully on her pommel, ready to kill him in a moment. I know more of your history than you do, young Silverskin. I know how Furn in all their guises fled their nemesis through the plains seeking sanctuary. At last, dragons and mortal kind, weary of flight, turned to fight their pursuers with such desperate physical and metaphysical ferocity they threatened the stability of the cosmic balance. The Black Naire, known for their neutrality in service of the balance, formed a guard, and a truce was called. And then she goes on about how they came to Kirin Noir and they protected the bees, but also about how she deceived the high priestess Zastera into believing she was on her side, and keeping the dragons asleep and eventually destroying them so that they can make the blue honey. She all along knew that this was a lie, and she loves betraying people who trusted her. So that's in her character. In the end, Elric and his allies defeat her and Dyfum Marluk. He kills Dyfum Marluk with Stormbringer, which rather surprises him. And then Moran, this strange god, grabs up both Ariok and Sionborg and makes them disappear. And I like this phrase. Then, with the air of a human conjurer, revealing his empty palm and offering the startled onlookers a gigantic and avuncular wink. So, he has a sense of humor. At the end, he and Moonglum have to go back to their world, to Karlak by the Weaving Waste, to meet with Zarazinia again. And he says, this is kind of a sad statement, but I like it. With a sense of resignation, Elric directed his horse toward Kirin Noir. The worst part of his adventure was still ahead. So then, in the epilogue, they talk about the meaning of myth, and I think this is the overall arc of the story. This sentence basically captures it. A myth has no meaning if it isn't based in reality. A people without myths is a people without identity. That's what his whole quest was for, to find out his people's identity. He learns this myth and finds out some terrible secrets, the secrets about the bees and what the Kirin Mori become, and the flight of his ancient people from the Foy Muir into this world, which obviously is not their origin point, and then they go to meet their final destiny. So what's the overall arc and overall themes? First, it's Melnibonéan history and Furn history and how they blend. That goes through all three of the books. The second is the battle between Sionborg and Ariok, and the battle between law and chaos, or as Moonglum calls it, the war amongst the angels, which becomes much more ferocious and pronounced in Stormbringer, the follow-up. And then also that sometimes it's better not to know the entire truth. Elric learns these things, and then, why, going back to the beginning, why doesn't he talk about them? Because they're unpleasant. They revealed that, the history of his race is not what he thought it was. It's not necessarily positive, that they are people who fled from a great enemy, and he doesn't really learn a whole lot about, why this happened or how the symbiosis happened, how reptilians and humanoids came to mate, and to have live youth instead of eggs. But that's not really necessarily a bad thing. The fact that there are still certain mysteries to him makes his journey a bit more poignant. The first two adventures, he was basically thwarted. The third one, he basically finds out what he wanted to know, but it's not to his assistance. Doesn't help him. He still has to go right off to his final destiny, which if you've read Stormbringer, you know. If you haven't, I won't spoil it for you. But I'll say this, if you expected a happy ending, you're reading the wrong series. I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it wasn't too long. I think, again, the novel is brilliant. I wish I had the limited edition Galanx copy, but unless I win the lottery, that's not going to happen, so I have to stick with my ARC here for the time being, which is, by the way, signed and personalized, so that makes it rather special to me. Okay, have fun. See you out there in the conjunction of the million spheres.